True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Summer Shipp reinvented herself after her divorce, but she always had a big heart and a lively, idealistic personality. When she disappeared in 2004, she was happy with her life. She had a close relationship with her adult daughter, Brandy, and she had a large group of friends. Money was tight, but she was about as far away from materialistic as one can be. Summer liked her job doing market research. It gave her some autonomy, and she loved to meet new people and learn about them. But her company sent her out on her own, going door to door, and sometimes this could be in rough neighborhoods. Her friends and her family worried about this, but she had no concerns. Join us at the quiet end for Searching for Summer Shipp. This is a case where many of the questions have been answered, but we don't know if her loved ones will ever have a true resolution.
So we're going to do a Missouri beer. Today's beer is the 30th anniversary ale from Boulevard Brewing Company in Kansas City, Missouri. It's an American strong ale, clocks in at 12.5% alcohol by volume. So we're going to sip this one and share it. It's a dark brown color, pretty lively effervescence. There's a thick tan head that disappears pretty quickly. Nice aroma, some dark fruit, cola, and vanilla. Getting a beer that tastes a little like Coca-Cola. Not really.
No, but the vanilla's nice. I like that.
And the taste leads off with vanilla and some cola, a little bit of fig, and a little bit of bourbon. It's a very sweet beer. The bourbon is there, but it's subtle. It doesn't get in the way. It doesn't make you think, oh, I'm just drinking straight whiskey or anything like that. So, good beer, good brewer.
Okay, it sounds delicious. Let's open it up.
Okay.
Okay, I've got my snifter because I'm going to sit down here and do some sipping while we talk. And just so I can get a head start on drinking, I think I'll have you start out the story today.
You drink, I'll talk.
Okay, great.
So Summer Shipp grew up under her given name Dolores in Granite City, Illinois. Her mother, Cora, raised her and her three brothers alone after their alcoholic father left the family. Now Cora raised her children as Jehovah's Witnesses, and this was a religion that Summer continued to practice throughout her life. She did stop attending services, but observed religion. She never celebrated Christmas or birthdays. She said that every day was a holiday, and she liked to buy her daughter and her friends gifts when it was her own birthday.
Isn't that nice?
It is. Sounds like a nice lady.
Really, really nice.
So Summer grew up in extreme poverty under pretty rough circumstances. Now, because of this, she was pretty frugal. But in her young adulthood, she married a wealthy man, John Shipp, and she lived for years in luxury. However, her difficult childhood in Granite City never was far from her mind. John Shipp was the manager for the local Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer branch, MGM, when he moved to Kansas City from Florida in 1969. Now, Summer had moved to Kansas City just a few months previously. She saw the city as a place to forget her past, and she's going to create a new life for herself.
Yeah, that was important to her to kind of start over. The childhood was rough. So John lived in the same apartment complex as a friend of Summer's, and when she visited that friend at the community pool, she really caught John's eye. Summer was not a classic beauty, but she was really pretty. At 5'1" tall, and just over 100 pounds, she was tiny. But she was a bundle of energy, sometimes described as sprightly. So although John had a girlfriend at the time, he broke things off with her to be with Summer. In October of 1970, Summer was pregnant, and she told John on the night he took her to see an advanced screening of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. And after that, they decided to move in together and just see if they could make things work. John's apartment became their first home together, and their front door was just feet from the pool. So John worked as he floated in the water and sunned himself. The phone sat nearby, and when it rang, he would just paddle to the edge of the pool and work on deals. So this is kind of living the dream.
I guess. Just float around in the pool.
Yeah.
The phone's right there.
Nice.
Good way to do it.
But he did work hard. He negotiated film showing contracts for hundreds of theaters throughout Missouri and Kansas. So he was really on his way up in the industry at this point. So Summer and John got married at the courthouse with John's brother and a friend of Summer's as witnesses. And they had a daughter who they named Brandy. She had red hair like her mother's, but even brighter and darker. And both Summer and John were just thrilled with this little girl. They moved out of the apartment and rented a cottage that Summer adored for a while. And then as the money kept coming in, 2 years later, they moved into a duplex in a very upper-class area, living near professional football players.
So John left MGM and bought an independent film distribution company called Thomas Films. And after he bought it, he changed the name to Thomas and Shipp Films. The company was more successful than he had ever could have been able to imagine. And he made a ton of money. So much money that he felt like he'd won the lottery. Now, he had come up from humble beginnings himself.
Yes, I think he and Summer really didn't know what to do with all this money. It was foreign to both of them. And I guess Summer was able to kind of not focus on it. She just wasn't that interested in having things. But I think John, it kind of affected him and he got carried away with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, her religion would seem to me to make her less desirous of money and what money can buy.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure she liked not having to worry about it like she had all her life.
Well, absolutely.
And remember, up until this time, she's still going by her original name, Dolores. But when Brandy was just a toddler, that's when she legally took on her new name, Summer. Brandy's middle name was Alexis, so Summer named herself Summer Alexis Shipp. And by the time Brandy was 3, John was making over $200,000 a year, and this is the 1970s. So I looked it up, and that's about $700,000 a year, equivalent in today's money. So a ton of money.
A ton of money.
Yeah. In 1974, they bought a 2-story English Tudor home in the exclusive Crestwood neighborhood, and they had a house with a huge private in-ground pool, an art gallery, a gym, a sauna, just everything.
Living the life.
Yeah, so Brandy was kind of spoiled when she was a little girl. It was almost unavoidable, even though she did get a lot of attention as well as things. But like I mentioned, John's lifestyle just became out of control as his income was soaring. He spent time on the West and East Coasts, partying with the rich and famous. Eventually, he found himself with an expensive dependence on cocaine and pills. And as John pulled away from his home and family life into this life, Summer just kind of channeled her love and attention into raising her daughter. So Brandy got a lot of attention showered on her. Maybe too much if that's possible. Do you think that's possible to give a kid too much attention?
No, but again, it depends on what kind of attention.
Well, here's my thought on it. You can give them too much attention if you're allowing them to control you, like when you're on the phone, they're trying to take your attention away. When people come over, when you have work to do. I mean, there has to be a respect as well.
Sure. Well, that's why I said depends on the kind of attention. Right.
So I think that it can be a bad thing when you get to the extreme, but that's not really the attention being the problem, I guess. That's more like the...
It's the fruits of the attention.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of the control. Like you want your child to see you as being in control of things. Well, and you don't want your child to take over control of what's going on day to day. Well, I mean, it can really be unhealthy. And they can have a rude awakening when they get older, and everybody's not just falling over themselves to please them.
Absolutely.
So I think that's another issue, is you don't want to raise them to feel entitled to everything. So anyway, I mean, they did love her, and it was a nice childhood, although she was probably a little bit spoiled.
Well, how does she turn out?
She turns out great.
Okay.
So in 1976, John took Brandy and Summer to the Cannes Film Festival.
Whoa.
And they spent time with David Carradine. Is that the Kung Fu guy?
Well, it's the Carradine family. I don't know which one is which. I think David was the Kung Fu guy.
Okay, and Cary Grant, whom I love.
We know who Cary Grant is.
Yes, he was in one of my favorite movies. What was it?
Sleepless in Seattle.
No, An Affair to Remember.
I know. I was going to say that next.
Okay. So afterwards, they went on an extended vacation to London, Rome, and Paris. And they flew back to the United States on the first Air France Concorde flight from Paris to Washington, D.C.
Well,
That's cool.
Yeah, that's cool. That's quite nice.
Yes.
Splashy.
Oh, totally. And Summer just felt like this poor country girl who was living like royalty. John became one of the biggest independent film distributors in the country. And they were dining with Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, and Clint Eastwood. Big names. Very big names, especially in the 70s.
Absolutely. Well, and Clint's still around working.
Yeah, he's still big. But as her life was changing, Summer really didn't change who she was, and I respect that. While John was traveling all over the world, she stayed home and spent time with her daughter. She also invited other children over for playdates, reading books and singing with them. So she liked to share in her good fortune, which I think is so important. She even took time to volunteer at a home for emotionally disturbed young women. And as a reward for good behavior, she would bring some of the girls to her house to swim for a day. And they loved it. I mean, they worked hard and did things so that they could earn a day at the pool.
So I like Summer. She sounds like she's got her head on straight and she's living the life.
Well, it's funny because I started reading the book about Summer that I found online, and I had no idea I was going to do the case, but I did just feel such an affection for this woman that I enjoyed reading the book. It wasn't like work. And I really enjoyed being able to read about her and her life.
Now, of course, John was away a lot of the time, and he had his drinking habits and his drug habits. So understandably, their marriage suffered. There was a large Christmas office party in the late 70s when Summer walked in on John, and he and other partiers were snorting large amounts of cocaine right on his desk. So she walked out feeling pretty angry and worried at the same time.
Sure. I mean, not only worried for John, but for her daughter. It's just very risky behavior that he was getting into, and their relationship was getting more and more distant.
Well, there's probably not a lot of good that comes out of a cocaine addiction, or a drug addiction for that matter, in a marriage,
Right.
Something's going to happen.
Well, and it's interesting that when things stop going so well for John and he has to really deal with things, he does get better. So by 1980, his company started going downhill. And the small films that John distributed were really being snatched up by the major film companies. Without that business, he was quickly falling behind on his debts, and he fell into some deep financial trouble because he hadn't saved enough. He was a big spender.
Well, yeah.
It happens.
Cocaine is not free.
I know, but wouldn't you just put enough in a savings somewhere in case the bottom falls out as a backup?
Well, most people would, but a lot of people just figure that there's no end to this stuff.
Yeah, I guess if you feel that way.
He's got this very, very successful company. Money's just rolling in. I'd be of the opinion that there's no change in that. Things are going to keep happening for me.
Well, and I'm kind of surprised that the way Summer grew up, that she didn't squirrel away more money. Because I personally am always waiting for the other shoe to drop, and I like to be prepared.
Well, yeah, but did she work?
Well, not really, no.
Okay,
not at that point.
So any money she had came through her husband.
Sure.
So what's she going to say to him? Oh, honey, I need an extra $1,000 this week because I'm saving for when you go bankrupt?
Well, I'd just say I want to start a savings account. I want to put $1,000 a week away, and it shouldn't have fazed him when he was making so much money. So it just surprises me. That's all. I'm not criticizing it.
It's just not as easy as it sounds.
Well, true. I mean, this was the 70s and 80s, so maybe he was kind of the dominant one in the relationship because he was making the money. So they ended up being off and on for a few months before Summer told John that she wanted out of the marriage. By this time, he was nearly bankrupt, and using what assets he did have to settle his debts. And he decided to move to Florida. Of course, he asked Summer to go with him and bring Brandy, because that's what he wanted. He didn't want to break up. But she refused. She was kind of done. She'd reached that point where she wasn't going to go back. So once in Florida, John leased a bait shop and a pier, and he became a fisherman. So he got himself off drugs and alcohol, made some new friends, and a whole new life for himself.
Boy, that's a big change.
Yes.
Kind of being this mogul who's hanging around with Paul Newman, Clint Eastwood, etc., to being a fisherman.
Right. Yeah, and there were storms and things that really caused trouble, and he could have left that business, but he stuck with it for quite a while. I think it was a good place to get off the drugs and kind of heal and get more perspective on life again after being in that whirlwind of celebrity and money.
Yeah, absolutely.
It can be hard to take.
Now, once her father got off of drugs and alcohol and cleaned up his act, then Summer allowed Brandy to spend summers and school vacations with him in Florida. Summer herself got a $2,000 check from John every month for 2 years. She also got the Bijou Theater that John had bought years earlier. This was a one-screen movie theater. Had never made a profit. I guess I'd get that and turn around and sell it to somebody.
Yeah, but Summer liked it. It was quaint.
It developed a bit of a cult following because it played Rocky Horror every Friday and Saturday night. And there were other classic films. So Summer loved it. She met many of her best friends while working the ticket window. So she had taken on the business enthusiastically, but in the end, she couldn't keep it running.
No, it just didn't make a profit, and she would look back and think she was very naive to think she could keep it. But, I don't think it hurts to try, and it was something she loved. Kind of really appealed to her artistic side. There were parties and people dressed up for the Rocky Horror, So it was kind of like having parties every weekend.
Yeah.
So for several years, John tried to make up with Summer and put their family back together. But she already liked her newfound independence and wasn't going to give that up. But still, the couple was cordial, and they didn't officially get a divorce until 1988. So they weren't really worried about getting the divorce until John met a woman he wanted to marry, who would become his second wife, and her name was Naomi. And Summer really liked her. She was a nice woman. She's very good to Brandy as well.
Now, to support herself, Summer took jobs, a bunch of jobs. House cleaning was one of them. In her spare time, she took on stray animals, and she took care of the elderly. She was very generous with her time. She offered rides to doctor appointments for patients, and even planned the funeral of an old guy she barely knew. She had 2 dogs, both of which were strays, and she treated them like her children. Now, to help pay bills, she also sold items at flea markets, and she began doing market research work. And she found that she actually enjoyed talking to new people, and she was often expanding on the preset questions she was paid to ask and spending additional time developing friendships. So she apparently had a knack for this market research.
Yeah, she really liked it, and to me it would be like a nightmare. That would not be a good job for me.
I don't think I'd want to do that, no.
No, but she was just super friendly and open. So the last day that Brandy Shipp spent with her mother, Summer, was December 3rd, 2004. Brandy was 33 years old by this time, and she was a very busy workaholic, putting in 60 to 80 hours a week. So that day was something that Brandy would remember fondly. And when she let herself into her mother's quirky 3-story home, she was not at all surprised to see 2 unknown older women sitting on the worn living room sofa. Summer and the women were talking about Summer's old stone house, and Summer was explaining that she'd bought the house because she knew she could rent out rooms to university students to make some money and help pay the bills.
In 2004, Summer Shipp was 54 years old. She was vivacious, a petite woman, skilled at cheering up the depressed and the despondent. Her neighbor, Evelyn, had brought her sister Leanne to see Summer because she thought meeting her would improve Leanne's spirits. Leanne had cancer and was tired and weak from her chemotherapy. So Summer focused her attention on Leanne. She seemed completely interested in Leanne's problems. As she shared stories of many of the items she had accumulated, in her colorful, funky little house.
Yeah, so for example, she had a dentist chair. And she also had a beauty shop chair with the dryer attached. So this was very funky.
I would say, especially with the dryer attached.
Yes, right? I don't know if it worked, but that would be neat. She also had a church pew that she'd bought at a flea market, and it was covered with vintage purses. So you can kind of get the feeling of what kind of person she was. Now, Brandy had come to her mother that day for some advice. She had linoleum floors that she needed to clean, and she had no idea how to go about this task. She'd had a housekeeper before, but now she was taking on cleaning her own house. Now, Brandy towered over her mother. She'd got her height from her father, and she was in a bit of a rush to get to one of her 3 jobs. And that's how Brandy was in those days, just really busy and focused on accomplishing things. But that day, Summer led Brandy into her kitchen as the 2 elderly women followed behind them. Summer turned on the stereo, tied 2 dish towels to her bare feet, and then she sprayed her own linoleum floor with dish detergent and warm water. So as they all listened and moved to the music of Motown, Summer moved her feet across the floor, dancing in the soapy water. This is how she cleaned her floor. So all 4 of these women were just in hysterics, and Summer removed the towels from her feet, wrung them out, rinsed them, and then began the process of rinsing the floor. So she had a big smile on her face, Brandy would remember, and she told Brandy that the floor was clean and she'd also gotten some exercise.
See, that's a good exhibit of multitasking, right?
Yes, and I love this story. I think it's a really good example of who Summer Shipp was.
Yes.
So Brandy was smiling as she left the house, and before she left, she told Summer that she was worried about her going door to door for her marketing job. But as she had before, Summer just said not to worry. She'll be fine.
Yeah, no problems.
Yeah, she really wasn't afraid at all, which I guess is just because of her openness. Do you think she was naive?
Maybe a little naive. Of course, she's been doing this marketing for a while, and she's never had any mishaps.
Sure.
So some of that might be, I understand that there's some risk of doing this, but what the heck? I enjoy doing it. I've not had any problems, so I'm not going to change.
I would just not go into people's houses like that. I would be worried, especially if it was a man that answered the door. There's no way in hell I'd go in the house. I'd be thinking serial killer immediately.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, you're projecting 2020 views.
That's true.
15, 20 years ago.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. So that was fairly current to not be worried, though.
But still, she's been doing this. Nothing's happened to her. So, yeah, I'm good.
Sure. And people do it. I mean, we have people come by our house for political things and religious things, and not too many people selling things door to door anymore, thankfully.
I can't remember the last time I had a salesperson come by.
Yeah, I can't remember that since back in my childhood when we would hide from the vacuum salesman.
Yeah, right. Have I got a Kirby to show you?
Yes.
Now, on December 8th, Summer had an hour-long marketing survey she needed to do in Independence, Missouri. She thought that she'd be able to get 4 or 5 interviews done. That morning, she got into her old BMW with her ever-present mug of coffee, and she drove over to Independence. She had been assigned this particular neighborhood by Roper Worldwide. Roper paid her according to how many completed surveys she turned in. So they allowed her 1 hour per interview, which meant that she pretty much had all day to meet her goal.
So by 2004, Summer had been doing this kind of work for years. And sometimes she did work in stores or shopping malls. But the surveys she did in people's homes paid more. But, they required in-depth interviews to learn about consumers' attitudes and behaviors. She was really good at this work, though, because she was a good listener. She had been that way since she was a little girl. The sincere interest that she showed really encouraged people to talk and share things with her. And also from her difficult childhood, she had an ingrained need for approval. So talking to people, whether friends or strangers, gave her that approval that she wanted.
Yeah, and at the same time, her childhood as a Jehovah's Witness made her very comfortable with knocking on people's doors and talking to them. Her mother used to take her out with her on her evangelism trips when they'd hand out Watchtower pamphlets and try to get invited into someone's house so they could proselytize for the religion. Now, these trips had been like adventures to Summer. She liked to see how people who weren't poor like her were living. Sometimes she might even get a snack or a piece of candy. So these are pretty much all good memories for Summer. She'd gotten used to having the occasional door slammed in her face, and she knew it was not a personal affront to her.
No, she was able to set it aside as not personal, which is a skill that you need if you're going to do this kind of thing, for sure.
I think you got to be pretty thick-skinned. I think it's more than a few doors that get slammed on your face.
Oh, sure.
Anyway.
Yes. So even though she didn't celebrate Christmas, she did love the special gatherings of friends and family around this time of year. So she just lost her mom a few months back, and she was still grieving over that. But she was happy too, because she was starting to think about the holiday season, and she just loved spending time with friends, and she often went along with friends as they shopped for gifts, and she enjoyed just looking around the shops. She also had a big party coming up soon she was going to go to, and she had it marked on her calendar. Her friend Susan was having an elaborate celebration for her 65th birthday in just a few days. All of Summer's closest friends would be there, and she was really looking forward to it.
Yeah, now this wasn't Summer's first time working in Independence. She's been there before. She drove past an area known for prostitutes plying their trade and parked on West College Street. This was a run-down neighborhood with poorly maintained, smaller homes. And it was the part of town that was known as the methamphetamine capital of Missouri. At the same time, Summer didn't like to judge people. She knew that anyone could end up living in a bad neighborhood due to circumstances beyond their control. And she liked to treat everyone with the same respect, regardless of their station in life. So she had a clipboard with her as she got out of the car, and it had the addresses of interview subjects and the forms she needed to complete.
So today's show is sponsored by Audible. Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment, and this includes podcasts, guided wellness programs, theatrical performances, comedy, and of course audiobooks. We've been Audible members for several years now, and I personally can't imagine living without it. Audible gives me the gift of found time because I can listen while I'm driving, exercising, making dinner. Even as I doze off to sleep at night, I can listen.
You do listen a lot.
I do. When you join Audible, you get 1 credit for any title, and you get 2 credits for Audible originals from a monthly selection. And what a lot of people don't know is that you also get access to daily news digests from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. With Audible, you can download titles so you can listen anytime, anywhere, even when you don't have Wi-Fi available. Even if you switch devices, Audible will keep your place for you too. So the Audible titles I'm recommending to our listeners today, the first one is Red River Girl, The Life and Death of Tina Fontaine, and this is about the murder of an Indigenous girl in 2017. So to complement that, I'd also recommend Highway of Tears. This is a really moving telling of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, all on Highway 16. And this is really shocking how society has failed these girls and women. This is a topic I've been interested in for quite a while. And these 2 audiobooks really complement each other, because one's about the specific case of a girl, and the other is a real wake-up call about how we need to do more in society to protect women, and especially these very vulnerable women. I mean, many just girls, really. For literally decades, Indigenous women and girls have gone missing or been murdered along the stretch of highway in British Columbia, and it's become known as the Highway of Tears. The narration and the prose are just like haunting and definitely touching. So the Audible app is free, and it can be installed on all smartphones and devices. To try Audible, just visit audible.com/brewery or text brewery to 500-500. That's Audible, audible.com/brewery, BREWERY.
Susan Lawrence Summer's friend had her 65th birthday party at the Pie Art Gallery in Kansas City, and this was on December 10th. Her family owned the gallery, and she had a large, and I mean large, network of friends and acquaintances. The evening was going well. Susan mingled with her guests and played her favorite music from a collection of CDs. But something worrisome crept into the party as guest after guest inquired about Summer. Where is she? They wanted to know if Susan had heard from Summer, if she had RSVP'd that she would be there. Just the expectation was that Summer was going to be there. She's really looking forward to this party.
Yes. I guess she wasn't one to reliably RSVP, but she was one who never missed a party with her friends. So Susan, of course, is busy with her party and her relatives, and she tried to push her worry for Summer aside. But as the evening wore on and Summer didn't show up, Susan did become truly concerned. Mutual friends Scotty and Linda came to the party, and they told Susan that they'd been trying to reach Summer all day. Scotty and Linda were very close to Summer. They had actually gone on a trip to Jamaica with her. So guests left the party periodically to try and reach Summer by phone, but no one got an answer. That same day, Brandy's ship was out running errands when her father called her cell phone. He asked if she had heard from her mom. Summer had been expected at the local Price Chopper grocery store that day to hand out food samples and coupons, but she hadn't shown up. Her boss had called John because she was worried about her. Summer would just never blow off a job. She did need the money.
Yeah, so Brandy, after talking to her father, she drove right away to her mother's house. And as she pulled into the driveway, she saw that Summer's car wasn't there. Front door was locked, so she's peeking through the glass, and she didn't have her key, her house key. So she drove back to her office and got the key, and as she drove, she called her father. So she asked her father to meet her at Summer's house. She told him that Summer's car wasn't there and no one had answered the door. So John agreed because he knew this was very unlike Summer. And he was pretty serious about this. This isn't something he was blowing off.
No, she's not a person that's just going to take off anywhere. It just didn't happen.
Well, he was concerned enough they'd called a friend, Butch Rigby, who is an attorney. This is before he really knows anything of what's going on.
Yeah, well, they know her and they know this isn't right.
Yep. He knew that while Summer could be somewhat unpredictable, she would never miss work without calling them. So he knew that something was really wrong with this whole situation.
Yeah, and Brandy was just nearly hysterical. John arrived at Summer's house just as Butch pulled in behind him, and Brandy was already at the bottom of the porch steps holding her key. She didn't want to go in alone. She was very nervous, and she waited for John to approach before she unlocked the front door. Then she stood aside, letting her dad and the attorney enter first. The first thing they noticed was dog poop on the carpeted stairway. Butch told John and Brandy to wait in the kitchen as he went upstairs to look for Summer. I mean, when Brandy saw the dog poop, she pretty much just lost it. She knew her mom would not leave the dogs. And by this time, the dogs...
Not for any length of time.
No, and by this time, the dogs had been alone for at least a couple days.
Right.
But the attorney, Butch, he didn't want either Brandy or John to find Summer if something horrible had happened to her. So he went upstairs to look while they waited in the kitchen. But by this time, Brandy was crying, nearly hysterical, and she called out for the dogs. One of them came running to her, while the other dog cowered in the corner. So the dogs were kind of confused. And these were already dogs with issues that had been rescued.
Traumatic for them.
Yes.
So Butch didn't find anything upstairs. He then called the police to report that Summer was missing, and John began calling hospitals, and Brandy called her mother's friends. Now, the Kansas City Police Department told Butch that 24 hours had to have passed before Summer could be officially reported missing. Now, it's been 3 days since Brandy had spoken to her mother. She is the last one to speak to her.
That she knew of, yeah.
However, the police department still refused to send out an officer. I'm not sure why.
Well, we'll get into that.
But Brandy called a co-worker at her mother's marketing company to find out where she had been working over the past 3 days. So the co-worker faxed a map to Brandy's work fax. Brandy went over to her office to get it.
Yeah, so when she got back with the map, she called the Independence Police Department. and she was able to tell them the location where her mother had been doing interviews. The desk clerk told Brandy that she would alert officers and that if anyone saw her or her car, they would let them know. And if they saw her, they should tell her that her family was looking for her. But they refused to make a missing persons report. So the police departments were in the practice of treating adult missing persons with complete dismissals and also with these 24-hour waiting periods. This wasn't part of police codes or laws, it was just this practice that they had due to understaffing. And also the officers were very poorly trained in how to handle missing persons cases at this time.
So their attitude is, we'll just ignore it and hope that things turn out okay.
Kind of, yeah. And people really weren't even notified like they should have been.
Now, fortunately, John Shipp still had some connections in public relations, so he contacted the major TV stations in Kansas City. Brandy and a family friend drove to each station to be interviewed. So on the 6 p.m. news, Summer's picture in the news that she was missing ran as the lead story. Now, this was just the beginning of a very frustrating and very desperate search to find Summer.
Yeah, so late that night, Brandy and a friend drove to an all-night Kinko's to print out some missing persons flyers. Then on Saturday morning, December 11th, friends and volunteers showed up at Summer's house to help search for her. They tacked up flyers on utility poles and gave them to local businesses, and there were at least 80 people coming and going from that house trying to help out. That day, over 40 people searched the area of West College Street in Independence, looking for Summer's old bronze-colored BMW. Two friends, Connie and Barb, saw a car that matched the description, but the license plate didn't match. And it ended up being Summer's close friends, Scotty and Linda, who found her car. As soon as they identified it, they called Brandy, who was searching nearby in the same neighborhood, and she ran over. And as she headed up the street toward the car, she saw there was a policeman parked next to her mom's BMW. And she ran toward the policeman yelling. He was just putting a third parking ticket on the windshield, clearly not aware that this car was supposed to be, he was supposed to be looking for it.
Yeah, he seemed pretty surprised to hear that the car belonged to a missing woman. He said that it had been parked there for days, and he was going to tow it because residents were complaining. Brandy was kind of in disbelief here, right? I mean, the car's been listed as missing, or Summer's been listed as missing. He should be aware of that.
Yeah, the officer hadn't been notified about Summer's disappearance, and he hadn't seen the news reports either.
No.
So upsetting for Brandy. And then when she peeked in the car, she saw her mother's personal items were still in there, as well as her coffee cup.
Yeah, now Summer's BMW was treated as a crime scene, so it's blocked off with that yellow crime scene tape. Then a large group of searchers were on the street. Brandy was taken into a cruiser, and she told her story to an officer about the mother's disappearance. He asked the same questions that she had answered for the Kansas City PD.
So it seems like there's absolutely no communication between these two, right next to each other locations, right?
Right. And John and Brandy Shipp filed a second missing persons report with the Independence Police Department. The search was complicated by the fact that two children, Sam and Lindsay Porter, had disappeared around the same time after a visit with their father. So this search, looking for two little kids, was obviously using most of the police department's resources.
Yeah, and this was quite a story. I looked it up after hearing about it. Sam and Lindsay were just 7 and 8 when they disappeared back in June of 2004, so it'd been about 6 months. And this was after their father had picked them up from their Independence home. Dan Porter, 44, would be convicted in February of 2006 of parental kidnapping with the intent to terrorize his ex-wife, and he was sentenced to 38 years in prison. After his arrest on the kidnapping charges, Porter told authorities several stories about what he had done with his children, including that he had cut them up and strangled them. But then he also told friends and relatives and the Kansas City Star that the children were alive and living with another family. So isn't this eerily similar to the case we recently covered about the 3 missing little boys, the Skelton brothers?
Oh, absolutely. Same thing.
Yeah, they've never been found. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, The remains of Sam and Lindsay Porter were recovered in 2007, and it was discovered that they had been shot to death.
Yeah, they found them after a 3-year search of land along the Missouri River. This was a well-known area to Dan Porter, the father, because he had frequently hunted on the property. They found the children's skeletal remains in dense woods next to a heavily populated area. And now the father, once the remains were found, the father admitted that he had killed his kids back in June of 2004. And for this, he was sentenced to life in prison.
Yeah, so it's just a really sad coincidence that these two missing persons cases happened in this same area near the same time period and really put a burden on the police's resources. And I'm not sure why they didn't pull in from the FBI or other departments, the state police. I'm just not sure. But it seems like somebody dropped the ball, or several people dropped several balls.
Yeah, I mean, these are emergencies, right? Looking for 3 missing people.
Yeah, they're both emergencies. And I understand that children are, it's a little more scary, but still. They really needed to put more on this case.
They did.
So Melissa Jennings worked at a bar called Nick's, and that was near where Summer had disappeared. Tips led the police to the bar to ask about an Independence man who had several prior convictions. And this guy's name is Jeffrey Sowerberry. Sowerberry and a neighbor both claimed to have been at Nick's at the time Summer Shipp disappeared, and she had disappeared, right in their neighborhood. So detectives showed Melissa a photo of Sowerberry, and she confirmed that he had been in the bar that day. Melissa remembered the 2 men at the bar because they had scared her. They had looked at her in this demeaning way, kind of looking her up and down and making creepy comments and whispering. And then they had harassed her, trying to get her to play pool with them. And then they tried to intimidate the only other person in the bar, who was a man, trying to get him to leave so they'd be alone with her.
Yeah, I think I'd be kind of creeped out.
Absolutely. Before the men left the bar that day, Sowerberry had reached out to shake her hand, and she reluctantly went to shake his hand, and he had grabbed her arm and yanked her toward him. So she'd reached for the phone to call 911, and he and his friend had laughed, kind of like chuckling. So she was really creeped out. And then a few days after being interviewed by the police, Sowerberry approached her outside of her friend's house. He asked her if she remembered him, and he thanked her for telling detectives that he had been at Nick's bar. So this really gave her the creeps, and she began to wonder if she was inadvertently giving him an alibi in Summer's case.
Well, yeah, I mean, if he is sincere in thanking her, she did kind of give him an alibi.
Yes, and that was upsetting to her, and he was kind of harassing her. He approached her many times about this.
So John Shipp's sister, Fran Nelson, flew from Orlando, Florida to Kansas City in order to support her brother and her niece. Fran had always been close to Brandy, and she admired how Summer, even as a very young mother, was staying with Brandy and taking care of her. Now, when Brandy was born, and you've mentioned this, Jill, John and Summer really indulged her. They wanted Brandy to feel free to express herself creatively. So they installed a gymnastics room, and Summer even took classes with Brandy. Brandy also had tap and ballet classes. Fran, Aunt Fran, right?
Yep.
Thought she was a bit of a spoiled brat as a child, but she had grown up to be a very loving, kind adult.
Yeah, but back after her parents divorced, Brandy had changed, and she'd gone through this wild adolescent rebellious period. Also, Summer had a bit of a wild period there where she dated and stayed out late. And Brandy became a rock band groupie, going all over the city to meet celebrities, like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, the Beastie Boys, and even Matt Dillon. He was filming, I think the name of the movie was Kansas, in Kansas City. But, Brandy had turned out okay. She graduated from Catholic high school and began working full-time, plus other jobs. She had a really strong drive to be financially secure, because she didn't want to have to worry about money the way that her mom did after the divorce. Now, Brandy did have what she called a little tiny marriage in Las Vegas one Valentine's Day when she was younger. She didn't know it at the time, but she'd married a man who was a drug smuggler, and he had smuggled drugs into the U.S. from Mexico. After he was incarcerated, Brandy flew to Arizona 2 or 3 times a month to visit him. But eventually she did figure out that this wasn't the best guy for her, so she divorced him, and it hadn't been even a year of marriage.
Well, you probably don't want to be married to a drug smuggler.
No. So it's probably really good for her that he did get arrested.
Oh,
God knows what could have happened to her.
yeah. There might be some collateral damage there.
Absolutely.
When Aunt Fran arrived at the house, Brandy was finally able to let go of all the emotions that she'd been holding inside. Fran was a motherly figure who loved her, and with Fran she could stop putting on her brave face and be Summer's little girl who was scared. So that first night, Brandy and her Australian Shepherd dog slept in the same bed as Fran.
Yeah, her Aunt Fran was important to Brandy during this time, of course. And she also had a man who she cared about. This was a guy who came to Kansas City to support her, and his name is Jeffrey Chase. Brandy had known him since the mid-1990s when they'd lived in the same apartment building. They'd been friends for quite a while until he moved to Texas for a new job in 1998. But after that, once a year, Chase traveled to Kansas City, where he visited his parents and Brandy. So in 2004, she had traveled with Chase to the Netherlands earlier that year, and that's when they began a romantic relationship. And they made plans for that Christmas of 2004 to visit Boston and then travel back to Kansas City for the holidays.
Sounds serious.
Yeah, but of course 4 days before Chase's flight to Boston, Brandy called him in a panic because her mother was missing. So he decided to fly to Kansas City and help her in the search. And when he arrived, Summer's house was the headquarters for the search. He said it was always full of friends, family, volunteers, news crews, and police. And John Shipp was there every day to speak with the press and to support his daughter. But of course this was a sad Christmas holiday. Chase and Brandy split their time between his parents' house and Summer's house, but mostly at Summer's house because, they were still very involved in this search.
Yes, it has been unrewarding so far, the search.
Yep.
A guy named John Underhill, who was a private investigator, he read about Summer's disappearance and he offered to help Brandy at no cost. Now, he is new to the city, and he had been a former Los Angeles police detective, so he knows his way around. And he got very involved with the case. Now, he certainly admitted that he hoped to get new business from his involvement in Summer's search, but Brandy felt that his heart was in the right place, that he really wanted to help. There wasn't any real huge ulterior motive for him helping.
No, they had a fundraiser for the Summer Shipp Reward Fund on December 18th, and they had a candlelight vigil on December 19th. Then on December 20th, 30 taxis, 5 city buses, and 2 billboards with Summer's picture and a phone number for tips were set up. Then there was a press conference on the 22nd, and the reward had gone up from $35,000 to $50,000. But these rewards rarely work. They really don't do a lot of good, unfortunately.
They don't seem to.
No.
I mean, it does get the publicity.
Yeah, a little bit, but
you're going to possibly make some money.
Yeah, but the statistics on who really collects those rewards is very low, and a lot of time is unfortunately wasted on tips that aren't legitimate, or people meant well, but they just weren't good tips.
Yeah. Now, by February of 2005, so we're a couple months down the road, right?
Yeah.
Summer's still missing. The private investigator Underhill, organized a shoulder-to-shoulder search in the area of a high school in Independence. During this search, a volunteer found a plastic card that turned out to be Summer Shipp's Sutherland's Friends and Family card.
Yeah, for a store named Sutherland's.
So that's important stuff.
You would think so, but when Underhill went to the police department with the card, one of the officers accused him of planting it, so they didn't take it seriously. And after that, Underhill felt like he had to leave the case because he didn't think he could be helpful now that he was in this adversarial relationship with the police.
Well, no kidding. Jeez.
Yeah, they weren't helpful.
They weren't helpful at all. And there was a friend of Summer's who had web design skills, and she created a website for tips, event notifications, any information that could be shared on the case. The website was called Friends of Summer, and early on, there are a lot of tips. And Jeffrey Sowerberry Remember him?
Yep.
His name was featured in several of the tips.
A lot of people brought him up. And through the website, Brandy became an advocate for other families with missing persons. And she began networking with organizations and people who were focused on missing persons cases. She and her father met with Independence police detectives every Friday. And she was so involved that she ended up losing her main job because she just really couldn't put all her time that she needed to into it, of course.
One evening in 2005, a resident of Independence named Darrell Wilson got a visit from Jeffrey Sowerberry, and he had known Sowerberry since he was a child. Sowerberry wanted to use Wilson's computer so he could go into chat rooms and meet women. He had apparently done this before, so it wasn't like a out-of-the-blue request. So Wilson watched Sowerberry on the computer for a while, and then he walked away for a few minutes to get a drink. When he returned, Sowerberry was looking at Summer Shipp news reports. And then Wilson remembered that Summer had gone missing on Sowerberry's street.
Yeah, according to Wilson, Sowerberry then confessed to him that Summer had come to his house and that he had choked her, slit her throat, and dismembered her. He told Wilson that he believed Summer was a spy and you just couldn't be too careful. But it would be years before Wilson would come forward with this to the police.
And why was that?
Well, he would say he was afraid.
Okay.
There's a lot of skepticism about whether it was true or not.
Sure.
But then in October of 2007, Summer Shipp's remains and some of her clothing were found by fishermen in the Little Blue River in Jackson County, Missouri. At this time, Brandy was with Jeffrey Chase in the Netherlands, where he had a big job opportunity. Her father and Independence detectives notified her that her mother's body had been found, and it had been found just 7 miles from where her car was found. So at this time, Summer had been missing for 3 years. They finally have this closure, I guess you could call it, but there's really nothing to be happy about. So her family had a celebration of life ceremony, and they buried her remains, which was not her complete remains, just what they found. So they buried that in a child-sized coffin.
Now, even before they were naming suspects or anything, Brandy went to a civil litigation attorney named John Kurtz. And she did this because she wanted to be certain that other door-to-door marketing reps would not be working on their own without safety precautions and safety training. Kurtz believed that the odds of winning a wrongful death lawsuit against Roper Worldwide were pretty slim to none, but nevertheless he agreed to handle the suit. So in this suit he claimed that Roper was negligent in sending Summer out to do door-to-door surveys without the equipment necessary to defend herself. The suit also claimed that Roper should have pre-screened the area for persons with violent histories and provide warnings. And it also claimed that surveyors should have been sent out in groups, not alone by themselves.
So I find that hard to really swallow, because that's really not realistic. Now, I would think that the person who's out doing these surveys should have to check in hourly with someone back at the office or something like that, and say, hey, I'm going into this house, I'm at this house, I'll call you when I'm done with the interview, and then call when you get to the next house. I think that might have helped. But it's really hard to pre-screen for people with histories. I think that the ACLU might have some problems with that too.
It'd be tough to do.
Yeah, but, I do think that they should have been in groups too. I don't think you should send, especially a woman, out alone. That's not safe.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, the company would say, but if I do that, I have to spend twice as much money.
Well, too bad, you know?
Yeah. So the suit got all the way to the 8th Circuit District of Courts. The suit got all the way to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals before it was thrown out. Now, Brandy was disappointed, but she did hope that the suit in some way might contribute to changing the procedures of companies that send people door to door.
Yeah, and things really haven't changed. There really aren't laws that I could find on this, but I think the policies could change.
Exactly.
Nothing happened criminally with Summer's case for years. And Brandy met a guy named Ed Rogue in 2009. He was working on her house, and she ended up marrying him in Florida in 2011. Just a simple ceremony organized by her Aunt Fran, because they'd gotten even closer now that Brandy doesn't have a mother. And once married, the couple returned to Kansas City to live, and Brandy began raising pug puppies.
In 2012, an Independence detective contacted Melissa Jennings, the bartender, in order to take a statement. Jeffrey Sowerberry was going to be on trial in a few days for the murder of William Kellett. Now, this is totally unrelated to Summer Shipp.
Exactly.
But the person being charged was a person of interest at some point, maybe still was.
Oh, definitely still was.
Summer Shipp's case.
Yes. So in the summer of 2012, the trial began for Kellett's murder, and Brandy John and his wife Naomi sat in the second row behind Kellett's daughter, supporting her. Investigators and lab technicians testified to how Kellett was killed, and he was shot first, but the bullet lodged in his neck without doing any real damage, and this was because the wrong bullet for a sawed-off shotgun was used. So the bullet didn't go past any real tissue, just through the skin. But then Kellett had been killed by multiple stab wounds and a slashed throat. So these things are similar to what that witness Wilson said that Sowerberry had told him about Summer. The victim also had defense wounds to his arms and hands, so this guy had tried to fight off the attack. Crime scene investigators took the jury through how they had found the sawed-off shotgun and a large knife in Sowerberry's possession just days after the murder. None of Kellett's blood was found on the knife, but years later they took the knife apart and found the blood. So that's quite lame as well.
Yeah, how do you miss that?
Well, remember, if Sowerberry had gone to prison back in 98 or 2000, we might still have Summer Shipp alive.
Well, yeah, but he didn't.
No.
Now, the mother of one of Sowerberry's friends from childhood testified that Sowerberry had been staying at her house in 1998, and he had visited the car lot where Kellett worked. According to this woman, Sowerberry was upset that Kellett had been picking on him, and he confessed to killing Kellett. Now, this woman testified she was afraid of Sowerberry and didn't want to testify.
Yeah, this seems like a very violent man. So he did end up being convicted for first-degree murder in the death of Kellett. And just 2 hours after that conviction, he was served with another grand jury indictment, this one for the murder of Summer Shipp. The prosecutor's office wanted to wait until the first trial was over before revealing the new charge for the murder of Summer Shipp, because she didn't want the news to interfere with that first case. So even though they were worn out from sitting through that trial, Summer's family and friends were really relieved that the man they believed killed Summer would be serving life in prison for the murder of William Kellett. But still at the same time, they wanted justice for Summer, so Brandy was happy when she heard about the new indictment.
And despite being indicted in 2012, the murder case for Jeffrey Sowerberry, in terms of murdering Summer Shipp, this case didn't begin until the spring of 2016.
Yeah, and that can be explained because he's already in prison, so it's really not urgent to get him off the streets or anything.
He wasn't going anywhere.
Right. Well, and plus, they really didn't have any evidence, unfortunately. Just some circumstantial stuff.
Right.
So the prosecutor began her case against Summer's accused killer by displaying pictures of Summer on a big screen and by talking about the early days of her disappearance. She talked about the day of the disappearance. On the day of her disappearance, Sowerberry had showed up at his neighbor's front porch right as Summer was leaving that house, and the neighbor had told Summer he wasn't interested in the marketing survey. But Sowerberry had tried to sell the neighbor some kind of phone service, and the neighbor didn't want that either, and Summer had walked over to Sowerberry's front door, and the neighbor had said to Sowerberry, "It looks like you're going to have company." So, pretty strong evidence that she did go to Sowerberry's house. There's no reason for this guy to lie.
Right, and we also know that after she was seen going to Sowerberry's house, she wasn't seen again. Then another neighbor of Sowerberry's told the police that they should talk to Sowerberry about the missing woman, Summer. However, despite searches being done on Sowerberry's home and vehicles, no evidence was ever found, and nothing was found in terms of that case until Summer's remains were found in October of 2007. Now, the prosecutor said that Sowerberry had told Darrell Wilson that Summer Shipp had come to his house, that he had choked her, slit her throat, and dismembered the body. but now Sowerberry denied that confession.
Well, and unfortunately, Wilson had 4 prior felony convictions at least, so his credibility was just an issue. So when the trial had started, Brandy Shipp was the first witness for the state, and she talked through the timeline of her mother's disappearance and of the search. After completing her testimony, she left the courtroom, but then she came back after the first break. So it's important to realize here that Brandy is not doing well emotionally. This was very tough on her. She was this active go-getter, and she was never the same after this. Her family didn't expect her to sit through the whole trial, but she did, and she sat through crime scene investigators' testimony, even as they detailed the evidence that had been found with her remains. But when the defense cross-examined the investigators, the defense emphasized that searches of Sowerberry's property had uncovered nothing.
Then the county's chief medical examiner gave testimony on the analysis she did of Summer's remains. She showed a close-up photo of a Greenstick fracture. These are fractures that we'll see typically in kids because their bones are still growing, but adults can do it too. It's basically a crack in the bone. Like if you took a green stick and bent it, it would crack and not break apart. So the medical examiner said that this break had occurred while Summer was still alive, and it happened near the time of her death because there were no signs of healing. Then the medical examiner determined that the cause of death was homicidal violence based on her body being found in a river. She also had a rib fracture, and her scarf was found near her bones, led the medical examiner to believe that Summer had been strangled with it. It was tied in a way that wasn't typical of how a scarf is worn, and she also added that a bra and jean pocket found near the remains were Summer's size.
So I hate to say it, but this is kind of weak.
Not much there.
The jury was asked to leave the courtroom while the defense attorney was arguing that if the medical examiner could not associate the scarf definitely with Summer Shipp, then the medical examiner had to change the cause and manner of death to indeterminate, not homicide. This is a major blow to the prosecution. So when the jury returned, the medical examiner changed her ruling, very reluctantly, from homicide to indeterminate. So things were not looking good. And there really was very little evidence. On the second day of the trial, Darrell Wilson testified, and he admitted to his prior convictions for intent to manufacture a controlled substance, possession with intent to distribute a controlled substance, and DUIs. He said that he had known Jeffrey Sowerberry since he was 10 or 12 years old. Then he told his story about Sowerberry's confession to him about, when he told him that he killed Summer Shipp. But when asked why he had waited so long to come forward, he said he was afraid. And that's a little weak. I can kind of see it, but if you're afraid, don't you want him to be put in prison?
Well, you would think. He's a felon. It's tough.
Yeah, and the cross-examination was not good for the prosecution either.
No, the defense brought out the truth that Wilson had worked previously as a confidential informant, where he'd wear a wire and talk to criminals to gain their confidence.
Well, and that doesn't sound like someone who would be too afraid to talk to police, right?
No. And then when pressed about whether he had a previous burglary conviction, he became very agitated and said that one of his convictions had been reversed. Then he was asked about some discrepancies in dates of Sowerberry's confession, and he ended up admitting to being confused. And before leaving the stand, Wilson lost it. He's yelling out, "By God, he killed that woman. He chopped her up and threw her away like garbage."
Yeah, so the prosecution's case just fell apart, in many ways. Sowerberry had been the prime suspect since way back when Summer disappeared, but there had never been enough probable evidence to arrest him. And the only way to convict him at this point was if the jury believed Wilson's testimony. There was really no physical evidence, and without the medical examiner finding the manner of death to be a homicide, it was really just looked at as speculation whether he committed this crime. So the jury deliberated for under 2 hours and found Jeffrey Sowerberry not guilty.
Not a surprise.
No, after the acquittal, Brandy stood outside the courthouse, and she admitted to off-camera reporters that she knew the state would have had difficulty proving his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But she held to her belief that he did kill her mother. Now, one thing that was disappointing for her, I guess, was that none of the jurors were allowed to know about Sowerberry's prior murder conviction. If they'd known, there might have been a guilty verdict. But you can't find someone guilty based on their history, really.
No, you can't.
Unless you're showing, like, a pattern. But this really wasn't a pattern. That was a different kind of crime, even though it was murder. But it just wasn't enough to get a conviction.
No, and she got no closure after the trial. She's relieved to know that Sowerberry's in prison for life. But for years, just finding her mother was her purpose, and then getting justice for her mother's murder became her new purpose. So without a conviction, she had difficulty coping with a lot of her life. She suffered from depression and psychological trauma. She and her husband Ed love the pug puppies that they raise, and Ed works hard in construction, but they do have financial problems. And then to make matters worse, Brandy has chronic back pain. So this once energetic workaholic hasn't been able to work since 2012. She does meet for regular lunches with her mother's friends, and they all toast Summer.
Yeah, so really a sad story.
Yeah, I mean, it seems reasonable to think that Sowerberry's the culprit, but there's just nowhere near enough evidence to convict.
No, and you just wonder how he would have hid the evidence. Because he didn't seem super bright. It's just kind of a fluke that he got away with that. But I think if, Wilson had been a better witness, that might have been enough to do it.
Right.
So our sources for this case include the Kansas City Star and a book called Searching for Summer by Anne Garrett Spry and Brandy Rogue. So Brandy Rogue, of course, is Summer's daughter, and Anne Garrett Spry is a woman who writes memoirs. She's written several memoirs, mostly for people who were still alive. But it was nice because the way she writes, it was a nice tribute to Summer Shipp. So it was very different than most true crime books that I read. So thank you as always to Tristan Capel for our TCB intro and outro music. Just a quick note, if you want to get more TCB and support our show, you can go to our website, tiegrabber.com, and become a Tie Grabber member. So a little bit about being a Tie Grabber member. You get an extra episode every month of our show, and it's a full episode, just as detailed as any other one. And also we send you a gift, and you have our undying love and loyalty for supporting us. So these commercial-free, members-only episodes come out every month. Plus there's quite a backlog, at least 40 episodes that are yours to listen to as soon as you become a member. So you could get a little binge. And you can be a member for as little as $4 a month. Not too bad. So let's go on to feedback now. If you have a case suggestion or comments about a crime or beer, please send us a voicemail or send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com. We really love to hear from our listeners. Also, a quick note that we do have a contest going on for who can write the best beer review. That'll be judged. How are you judging it, Dick?
I'm judging it in my own mind.
Yeah, so can you give any advice to what kind of review would win?
So what I'm looking for in these beer reviews, I want to see some personality or hear some personality. I want some detail and just the overall charm of the review. You don't have to be a professional beer drinker or beer taster. Just tell me what you like about the beer or what you don't like about it.
Yeah, and you also don't have to be a professional audio person. Right? You don't have to have recording equipment, just a simple voicemail.
That's all.
Or emailing us a voice memo from your phone would work.
Pretty simple.
Okay, so what do we have for feedback?
Well, I've got one voicemail and a couple emails. Let's do the voicemail first, and you can hear from Darby, who has a case suggestion.
Hey, Jill and Dick. True Crime Brewery is 5 stars all the way. Y'all don't know it, but you keep me company every day when I'm working around the house. I live in a small South Carolina town, and my case recommendation is for Pee Wee Gaskins. He's been called the meanest man in America, and also the redneck Charles Manson. He lived in Sumter, South Carolina, just up the road from where I live. I've never heard a podcast cover him, but he was a prolific serial killer back in his day who struck fear in the hearts of his enemies in spite of his meager 130 pounds. He was a horrible person, but I think he'd make for an interesting episode. I don't have a beer recommendation for you. Maybe I can get one from you. Keep the great episodes coming.
Well, thanks, Darby. We love your accent. So
Yep.
cute. Yeah.
Sounds familiar. I lived down there in Columbia for several years before moving back to Maine. So, good sound.
Yeah. And what do you think of this case, Pee Wee Gaskins? Did you look that up?
Donald Henry Gaskins, otherwise known as Pee Wee. And he was called Pee Wee because he was rather diminutive in size. I think he was like 5'2", 130 pounds. But he was an American serial killer from South Carolina, as Darby said. He was convicted for killing 9 people, and in interviews claimed to have killed 100 to 110 people. Now, who knows? This might have been just Pee Wee bragging about things.
So were all his victims in South Carolina, or did he travel?
Well, he might have traveled a little bit out of state, but he wasn't like Israel Keyes, who traveled all over the United States. Confined his killings to the southeast United States.
Okay. All right. Interesting suggestion. Thanks again, Darby.
And just one final thing, Pee Wee was executed in the electric chair in 1991. He was one of the early people. Once the death penalty got put back in South Carolina, he was one of the early ones to get it.
Okay, so I have an email from Christy. Christy says, I would love to hear a podcast about Amanda Brumfield. She is Billy Bob Thornton's daughter, and she was convicted of killing her friend's child. As far as I know, no other podcast has covered it. The case leaves me with so many questions. I would love to hear what Jill's research and Dick's expertise have to say about the case. Hope you will consider it. So Amanda Brumfield, she was the oldest of 5 children that are Billy Bob's, and she was convicted in 2008 of aggravated manslaughter in the death of her goddaughter, who was an infant.
She was a 1-year-old, approximately.
Yeah. So I had never heard of this before we got this email. So thank you for bringing it to our attention, Christy. We'll definitely look at that.
Yeah, the claim was that the baby was trying to climb out of her playpen and fell and hit her head on the floor. She had like a 3 to 4 inch skull fracture. So it seemed like the extent of the injury was disproportionate to the story of falling out of the playpen.
Yeah, I mean, little kids fall a lot, and they usually just bounce a little because they're very, their bones are still kind of cartilagey.
Yes, and she's appealing. She's been in prison for about 8 years and is still in the process of going through appeals.
Very sad.
Truly sad.
And then we have an email from Caitlin.
Caitlin writes, First, I contemplated sending a voicemail, but I'm too damn shy and I hate the sound of my own voice. Sounds familiar, doesn't it, Jill?
Yes, but I do a podcast, so you can overcome it.
Anyway, my case suggestion is the 2009 LA Fitness shooting in Bridgeville, Pennsylvania, which is basically a suburb of Pittsburgh. The gunman was a guy named George Sodini. He planned the shooting for months, and he kept a diary or log of his days leading up to the shooting. His entries are just plain creepy and disturbing. In all, 3 people were killed, and 9 were injured, and then Sodini killed himself. One of the women who died was a close friend and co-worker of my father's. Very sweet woman. I was devastated when I found out about her death. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this case. Plenty of articles and information to look into. Thanks for always keeping me entertained.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for writing, Caitlin. This is another one I've never heard of.
No, and this is a lot of people.
So this was one of those guys, and there have been a lot of mass shooters with this issue, that they feel like women are rejecting them and they're angry at the world.
It's thought to be that from his writings and stuff, he was claiming that he couldn't get a date, he couldn't have sex with women, he just was looked down upon by those nasty women.
Yeah, so obviously some mental illness there, but you have to wonder if social media and the way that people just aren't engaging like they used to. A lot of isolation going on out there.
Yep.
And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing more of this.
Oh, sure.
But excellent recommendation.
Yeah, we got some good ones.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
We'll be here, because we'll still be drinking this 30th anniversary ale. Told you it was a sipper.
Yes, very good.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.